Hello, my name is Claudio Ghirardo. I am a indie publisher, Comics DaDa, and I also do Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, under the pseudonym KV Gear. And right now, you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Claudio Ghirardo about his latest comic book projects. Please like and subscribe to this website by hitting the subscribe button, so you'll be notified about new podcast interviews and article posts. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. Based in Mississauga, Ontario, Claudio Ghirardo is a multi-disciplinary visual artist, contemporary figurative painter, and illustrator. He's a graduate of the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art and has been a freelance illustrator and gallery artist for many years. Claudio uses traditional art forms such as painting and drawing to explore streams of consciousness, narrative, process, and people. He's mainly a self-taught artist, having spent years studying works of the modern masters and many of today's contemporary artists, infusing that with many years of reading comics, watching cartoons, and looking at fantasy and science fiction illustrations. His latest projects are Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, and Comics DaDa. Using an alter ego, calling himself KV Gear, Claudio has created a comic book in the tradition of Asterix, Karl Barks's Uncle Scrooge comics, and Scud the Disposable Assassin called Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, now available on globalcomics.com. Also available through globalcomics.com, Claudio has created Comics DaDa, along the lines of his more experimental surreal comics. One of his stories has been accepted and will be published in Longview Review, an arts and literary magazine published by the University of Connecticut this May. So without further ado, here's my chat with Claudio Ghirardo about his latest comic book projects. So Claudio Ghirardo, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Well, actually, John, I appreciate your support in this. So,
absolutely. No, we haven't talked in like a dog's age, to tell you the truth. So it's great to catch up, and I appreciate your time. That's for sure.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So before we get going with all the questions, I would like to know, what are you reading today?
Well, that's quite interesting because, first of all, I'm into medical physical stuff. So I'm reading a book on the Enneagram. It's basically a personality test that was developed by the mystic Sufis thousands of years ago. And it's being used quite a bit today. So that's one of the things I'm reading. I've started reading a Rolling Stones article on the life and times of Pink Floyd. And as far as comics are concerned, we were in Ottawa recently, so I picked up a bunch of French books that I really enjoy. One is by a French artist by the name of Francois, and it's called Ideas. I might be probably butchering this, so Ideas Noirs. So there's that one. And I'm also getting into the absolute books as well, so that's what I'm finding that interesting.
Wow, you got time to read. That's good. I barely have time to do anything, so that's good for you.
Well, I got the books. Doesn't mean I read them all.
Okay, you got me there. That's good.
I'm gonna get to it eventually.
Sure, all in good time. Now, you reached out to me and you were keeping me up to speed about some of your latest projects, and one of them is called Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, on Global Comics. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What's it all about?
I wanted to do. Well, I grew up when I was a kid. I was living in Italy. Between the ages of 6 to 9. And then during the summers, I would go to Italy quite often. So I was exposed to a lot of European comics. And one of the ones that was really exposed to quite a bit was, of course, not just Tintin, but also Asterix. And also the Disney characters are very popular in Europe. So Donald Duck, Scrooge McDuck, they're extremely popular. They always come out on anthologies. So I wanted to try and see if I could do a comic along those same lines where it's kind of humorous, but adventure humor, something like that. And Huibert is also a bit of a parody on superhero comics because the reason I called it the most underrated hero to hire is because he's not what you would consider a hero. Most heroes, when you see them in the comics, they're buff, they're muscular, Huibert is not. He's actually the opposite. If you look at the strips, he's actually slimmer. He's got a bit of a pear shape to him, but he wants to be a hero. So I kind of came up with that idea from Man from La Mancha, which is the Don Quixote character who, he reads a book on chivalry and all of a sudden he becomes a knight. So Huibert has a bit of what I call a Don Quixote complex, where he wants to be a hero and he's going to be a hero. And so he's underrated, but he's actually a very effective hero. The character basically hires himself as a hero, not to make money, but just for people who need him, they know where to come and get him. I wanted to do more a comic along those lines, trying to reach back into my childhood, especially when living in Italy. So that's basically where the premise of the idea of Huibert came from.
Ah, very good. Now, with this particular comic book, you're calling yourself KV Ghir. I guess it's a pseudonym. Why would you do something like that now?
Well, the thing about comics and even art and illustration is your style becomes almost like your brand. So you're known for that. Most of the works I do is basically experimental or surreal, especially my contemporary artwork, contemporary paintings. So in order to do Huibert, I felt it was more important, especially I wanted to use a more, for lack of a better word, more commercial style. So I decided to come up with an alter ego. So KV Ghir actually is like K stands for Cristofo, which is, Italian for Christopher, which is my middle name. Vladio, which is V, obviously a version of Claudio. And Ghir is basically like my last name, only with the GIR. So I figured that would be a really cool way of doing it. It's just to keep the two separate. So, so people don't get confused by, why is Claudio doing these kind of drawings when this is what he's known for? The same way as I tell people, it's like Jean Giraud when he went by the name Moebius.
Right.
Jean Giraud was the guy who drew Blueberry. Mm-hmm. But who's the artist who does the surreal stuff is Moebius. So I decided to go with the same route. I mean, I've heard that there's some other one. He's a very well-known artist who's worked with Grant Morrison, Frank Whiteley. I found out that's not his real name. His real name is Vincent Dagan, but he came up with Frank Whiteley for the comics. So I just figured, so it's just to keep the two separate.
Sure, makes sense. Now, you've published this under a company called Global Comics, and I apologize, I'm not too familiar with it. Why did you choose this particular company?
I was thinking about whether or not to publish it and then making the tours. But financially, I'm kind of strapped, and also I want to try and reach an audience. So when I was looking at there's webtoons, of course, and there's tapas, but somebody let me into Global Comics as like it's a growing one that's like I said, growing right now. So I figured, let me go with Global Comics. And it was pretty easy to put up. Yeah, I think the other reason was because when I look at something like webtoons or tapas, it seems the majority of comics, they're all manga, basically. So I wanted to also go somewhere where it was a little bit, I don't have to kind of, go in competition with other manga comics. So Global Comics was a much better fit for me. And this way, what I can do is I post it on there. Now, I do put it up. It is for free, just because so people can get an idea what it's like and get used to it. Yeah, I think this basically it's just, and then of course what I can do is I can do a lot of digital, like go Facebook and Twitter, Blue Sky, to help promote it.
Ah, okay, makes sense. Now, you were telling me that you have another book on Global Comics called Comics DaDa. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What is Comics DaDa?
Yeah, Comics DaDa is basically a lot of comics where I use my more experimental surreal style where I just experiment with the comics medium. So I do all kinds of crazy stuff. The figures, the joints are more manipulated and twisted. I bring in more modern art things like expressionism. It just allows me to do stories where a little out there more and a little different than the KV Ghir style, which is, of course, more, I would say it's more of a commercial appeal, whereas Comics DaDa, the word Dada is actually from the art movement. Dada, the Dada movement basically means it's almost like anti-art. It's almost more out there. So that's why I call it Comics DaDa. So when you look at those comics, those are not your typical comics that you would see or find anywhere. That's the best way to describe it.
Right. Now, you were also telling me that one of the issues has been considered for a literary magazine. Can you talk a bit about that one?
Sure. It's actually the story is called Wollstonecraft, which actually is a story about Mary Shelley. Shelley is actually her married name. Her actual name was Wollstonecraft. And she is the one who came up with the book Frankenstein. I read Frankenstein years ago when I picked up the book with Bernie Wright's illustrations. What really amazed me was that Mary Shelley was actually 19 years old when she wrote this book. And I'm like, how did she come up with a book that basically was considered to be the very first science fiction horror book? So I was doing a little bit of reading and I was like, holy cow, like her mother was a feminist who died giving birth to her. Her father was an anarchist and a professor, and they were both writers. She married John Shelley, who was a poet and writer at the time. And, by the time she was 19 years old, she was on her second child. Her first child died. And I said to myself, it's almost as though all this stuff came together that basically in her life that she was able to come up with the story of Frankenstein. And so I wanted to do a story where it explores creativity. Like, where do you get your ideas and what happens when you actually take all these ideas, your experiences that you have in life, and how it all comes together. And in this case, it's more of a fictional story. It's not exactly how it happened, but it was basically a way to really explore creativity, but also how this 19-year-old girl came up with basically almost like the book that was of the foundation of science fiction and horror. And yeah, I submitted it to a magazine called Long River Review, which is an arts and literary magazine through the University of Connecticut, and they accepted it. So it will be published I believe it's in May. It will be published in May.
Oh, that's great news. Terrific. Good for you. Good for you.
Thank you.
I've probably asked you this question before, but I wonder if you could walk me through your creative process, because looking at both the Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, and Comics DaDa are two different styles, but I'm wondering if the process is the same. Can you walk me through that?
Sure. The process is pretty much the same, but what I do is, to explain it better, I have to almost like put myself in a different way of thinking. So, for instance, when I do Comics DaDa, I tend to look very much at modern contemporary art. So I go to a lot of galleries, and I have friends of mine who are artists, so I go to their shows, and I look at different artworks. So, for instance, I would look at the works of Dave McKean, the works by Bill Sienkiewicz, and a lot of European comics. So it puts me in that kind of frame of mind to do this type of work. And I would almost say that the Comics DaDa or the experimental style is more a part of me that has matured and wants to explore and try different things. Whereas when I do Huibert with the KV Gear style, it's more a way to get in touch with my childhood when I was a child and the comics I used to read as a kid. So, I mean, of course, I'm giving my age away here. This is in the 70s when I was living in Italy, and we would have the old Marvel reprints of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, that by Kirby, basically, and Steve Ditko. And so where the process is similar is still trying to come up with characters and a look that would fit the story. The only big difference is I had to put myself in a different frame of mind. And so that's what I had to do. So when for instance, for Huibert, I would look at One Piece. I would look at, I don't know, it's an artist that's highly underrated, in my opinion. His name is Mark Hempel, and he did a line of for Sandman, comics for Sandman, but he also did other ones as well. He did Breathtaker and Gregory. Then, of course, I would look at Asterix as well, because I have some Asterix books. So again, it's still coming up with different ideas, but it's just putting myself in a different mindset. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. And what tools do you use? I assume you're a traditional artist, right?
Yeah, I still prefer using the traditional art. I mean, I have done digital. I've been experimenting with digital using Photoshop and Procreate. So what I do with Comics DaDa is I use mainly watercolors and pencils and pens, a lot of mixed media. And sometimes I would bring it into my computer, and then I would also maybe add some colors through maybe Procreate or doing a large swatch of block. Like I remember, you used to use so much ink just to do this big section of black. Now I just bring it to the computer, I click there, it's all black. For Huibert, again, I use pen and ink and pencils, but then again, I bring it over to digital and just to fill in the blacks and also to clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up. Or let's say I made a mistake somewhere, I can usually fix it on digital. It's funny because one of the books I have here is by Milton Caniff. And I saw some original Milton Caniff pages, and Milton Caniff used to love whiteout. So when something didn't go right, he would just white everything out. And I always laugh at saying to myself, if Milton Caniff was around these days, I think he would love the computer just to erase everything and redo it.
A time saver, I guess, for the most part. That's what the digital component adds to it. And I guess more accuracy, I guess you could say.
Well, a little bit more accuracy, but what it does is just, it's time consuming, but more, like I said, the problem with when you used to ink in blacks and you had to cover an area in black, you would use so much ink, and your large brush. Whereas this is just like, you bring it in, click, that's done. And also just when you have to clean something up, it's a lot easier to do it digitally than it is to actually having to erase something, or like even when make a mistake with the watercolors, you have to basically try and wet everything out, and then you damage the paper. So I try and use a combination just to see what's more effective for the storyline purposes.
Right. Well, we've been talking about Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, and Comics DaDa. I'm wondering if you have any other projects on the go that you can talk about.
Yeah, well, I've actually just finished another comic that I'm going to be putting on Comics DaDa. It's called The Cartoonist Musings. And basically is the story about a cartoonist in 1924. Back then, the cartoonists were actually hired and would actually work on staff in newspapers. And they would actually come up with comic strips. And so it's based on, the comics they used to enjoy, also called Little Nemo in Slumberland, Crazy Cat by George Harriman. And so the story goes about this cartoonist who's struggling to come up with a comic strip idea. He meets this waitress, and this waitress, for some reason, is able to always inspire him in a weird way. And then, so he comes up with a great strip, and it does really well, and he has to continue getting some more ideas, and the waitress again helps him. And at one point, the cartoonist is wondering why he can't get any more ideas. So he's struggling. It's like, what was the one thing that got me going? It's like, wait a minute. It was this waitress. What is it about this waitress that seems to always inspire me, or it helps me get all these ideas? And I'm going to leave it at that. I just finished doing that one. I'm involved in something called the Comic Jam through Discord, where you're given a theme and you do some artwork for them. And I got this really cool 2-pager I'm doing. I was, of course, involved in a couple of anthologies for Kickstarters. I think the recent one, I think you interviewed Daniel. And so I did a 4-pager for Daniel for his anthology, La Zona del Male. And I'm also figuring out what's the 3rd issue of Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire. So in this one, I got the idea, basically, Huibert is actually hired by a very wealthy heiress in New Orleans. They have to tackle a supernatural being. That's going to be the next one I'm going to be working on. So
it sounds like you got a lot on the go, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So with everything you have going on today and the future, where do you recommend that people go online to find out more about you?
Well, my first recommendation is go on Global Comics and look for Comics DaDa, where you can see 2 of my comics there. And then eventually my 3rd one will be posted soon. You can go to KV Gear Comics, where you will see Huibert, the most underrated hero to hire, issue number 1 and issue number 2. I'm also on Twitter under @CGirardo. And if you want to look for KV Gear, 1 capital K V Gear. I'm also on Instagram, again, CGirardo64 and KV Gear, also on Instagram. See how confusing this gets when you have too much. Like, oh God, it's like I have to try and keep track of everything. It's like, oh man, but what the heck? This just shows the level of sanity I have, basically. And then you can also find me on Blue Sky. Again, C. Ghirardo and KV Gear and Twitter, and I can't remember what else at this point. Sorry, but anyways, that's where you could pretty much find me.
Well, Claudio, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
I think the only thing I would really ask is that the audience does consider more indie comics. There's a lot of indie stuff out there that's really being well done, and it just doesn't seem to get enough notice. So I say just take a chance. I mean, you never know what you could come up with, which is a gem. I mean, one of the ones I've come across recently is, I know about them for a while, is The Peregrines, which is actually done by the Group of Seven Comics.
Yes.
So, that I've been enjoying that with work by Jason there. And then there's, of course, La Zola Male, which I'm coming out. So I think that would be the only thing is let's be a little bit more supportive of indie comics. I think that would be the main thing.
Thanks to Claudio for the chat. You can discover more about Claudio's comics, Comics DaDa, and Huibert, the Most Underrated Hero to Hire, on globalcomics.com. Claudio is also available on Instagram at instagram.com/cghirardo64. And thank you for tuning in to the True North Country Comics podcast. I invite you to visit the True North Country Comics website to listen to even more conversations and discover how creators are making comic books and graphic novels. I also encourage you to subscribe via the website to be notified about new podcast interviews and article posts. This podcast is available wherever podcasts are enjoyed. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can follow along True North Country Comics on most social media sites, and you're encouraged to send any and all feedback to John at truenorthcountrycomics.com. Thanks for tuning in, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2025.